Before I start, Phil's story made me think of a story. One time, I was at one of the only times I didn't grow up going to Bible camp, but the first time I volunteered at a camp. Pretty sure it was mostly the leaders. We were all in a big circle, and we were going to wash each other's feet. And usually when you wash each other's feet, it's just kind of like you just pretend to wash each other. You just kind of like drip water over them, and you did it. Because no one really wants to like get right in there. But there was one guy, and he was a big guy, and he had a little bit of special needs. And he took off his sock, and there's like toe jam just like falling out all over the place. And the guy goes and like he starts to wash his feet, and the guy leans back and goes, "Oh yeah, get right in there." So to his credit, he did wash the guy's feet, and I will never forget that. It was like, man, that is serving someone. Yeah. So why don't I pray, and then we'll get into the message. Lord, I thank you that you are good, and for the privilege that we have to gather together. I pray that as we look into your word, that you would help it to be clear, help us to understand, and help us to grow closer to you. In your name, amen. So, congrats again on making it here through the storm. I read a story once, and I don't remember where it was from. I was trying to figure it out, but I couldn't. But it was there was a university or maybe a Bible school or seminary class, and it was one of like the last classes or courses that these students were taking. And so kind of one of their last assignments was going to be to teach a class. So it was, I will say, room 201 on building over here. So they show up 5 minutes before, because you can't get in there too early because there would have been another class. And so they show up there and they see a note on the door, and it says, "Class moved to room 301 in building on the complete opposite side of campus." And so they're always like, they panic, like, oh shoot. So they grab their stuff and they're booking it across campus to try to get to the class that they're supposed to teach as less late as possible. And unbeknownst to them, the assignment actually isn't teaching a class. There was a homeless guy. May have been an actor or something, but he was in the middle of them, and I'm pretty sure he needed help with something. And so as these students were racing across campus, they would see this homeless person in need of help. And the assignment is, after all the stuff that we've taught you about who God is and serving him, are you going to stop and help this poor man? Or are you going to be wrapped up in your old world and just keep going to class because you need to get there? And just about every student just hardly noticed the guy, just kept on going. But I kind of got a little taste of that. So this morning, I got up early to try and get to the church early so I could review my message and everything. But I first said, well, I got to dig Shelby out so that she's not trying to get the van out in this weather. So I opened my garage door, which opens to a back alley, and there's a car kind of just stuck, obviously, in the back alley. And I was like, well, it's right by an apartment building. You could see that's where they came from. So I was like, oh, they probably got stuck. And I'm like, well, car's staying here, and went back in. So I shoveled my little section, and I looked. I was like, well, if I'm preaching on serving one another, I better at least go make sure. And sure enough, I walked up, and there's this older lady just sitting there. And like, do you need some help? She's like, yeah, that'd be great. So I walked up and took 10, 15 minutes and shoveled her out and got her on her way. I was like, well. And then I looked and I thought there was another car, but it was actually the car that was coming to help her get out. But so it was like, man, it was a good, I was already later than I wanted to be, but it was good to actually have a practical way of like, yep, I'm going to do what I am preaching about, because otherwise that wouldn't be very Christ-like. So we're going to turn to Galatians chapter 5 and read verses 13 to 15. Actually, we're just going to start with verse 13. So throughout the book of Galatians, Paul has been kind of attacking some of the wrong teaching that has been going on in Galatia. Mainly, people were teaching that in order to be saved, you still had to obey and follow the Jewish law. And Paul is saying, no, that's not the case. If you're still trusting in the Jewish law to save you, then Jesus is actually worth nothing to you, because we are only saved through what he has done, not through obedience to the law. We're not slaves to the Old Testament law anymore. So let's read Galatians 5, verse 13. It says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." So we're not required to obey every law in the Old Testament, but that doesn't mean, okay, now you're free to do whatever you jolly well please, because our hearts are sinful and they will lead us towards sin. So no, instead of sinning, we're supposed to serve one another humbly in love. I don't think the ESV has the word humbly, but different versions will have that in there. I think the first thing to touch on, though, is the most crucial part of this is what we touched on last week, the in love part. So Phil talked about how important love is in every aspect of our lives, and we got big posters last week that kind of demonstrated that love encapsulates every single other one of the one another commands that God gives. If you don't love, you've missed the whole thing, right? Like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 2, you can be the most amazingly gifted and skilled person in the world, but if you don't love, it's absolutely useless. You're like a clanging gong. So in order to serve well, we need to remember the tremendous love that God has shown us and look and depend on the Holy Spirit to let his love pour out of us. So none of these one another commands are things that we're supposed to do on our own strength. They're all things that we look to God and do them through his love for us. Now, let's talk about, what does Paul mean, what does God mean when he tells us to serve one another? So what comes to mind when you hear of serving one another? Like, we might think of waiters serving us food. You might think of shoveling someone's driveway. Generally, things like going out of your way to be nice or do something nice for someone. Usually, it'll cost you some effort, may cost you some money, but at the end of the day, they're really thankful, they're blessed, and you leave with your heart full knowing, man, I blessed someone with my service today, and it's great. And as I was thinking of serving one, I thought of Friendship Inn. As youth group, we've gone a number of times to the Soup Kitchen in Saskatoon, and by the end of the day, you're exhausted, also because usually you go to a trampoline park the day before, which is exhausting, but you help provide food for less fortunate. You work from 7 in the morning till the afternoon, and hopefully you have good conversations, able to point the other volunteers to the Lord, and it's definitely serving, and it's exhausting when it's really good. But unfortunately, maybe for us, the word that Paul uses here for serving envelops a lot more than just doing nice things for other people. These are the ways that the word for serve that Paul uses here is used in other places in the Bible. To be a slave to be in bondage to, or to serve or to do service. So the root word for serve is slave. Just like serve, we have the word servant. Now, I don't know about you, but in my mind, there's a big difference between be slaves to one another and serve one another. But let's think about that for a bit, because I think there's some key differences that are important for us to take note of. First, if you are a slave, how often are you supposed to serve your master? All the time, That's your full-time job to do that. You're to do that not only when it's convenient, all the time. And likewise, for us, serving others is not something that we occasionally do when we feel like it or when it's convenient for us or when I'm feeling really generous and kind today. I'm going to go serve somebody. It's not a special event. It's supposed to be integrated into who we are as followers of Christ. We serve because that's who we are. It's not an add-on. Secondly, whose needs does a slave consider? They don't just think of themselves, they think of their master. He doesn't just think about his needs or his desires or his wants. A good slave is very attentive to the needs of his master and eager to step in and serve at any and every moment. They even will serve at their own expense or like exhaustion and all that kind of stuff. Even when it hurts, they will serve. In our culture, we're often so self-focused that that's really hard to do. Right? Like most of the time, we're not even aware of the needs of the people around us, and we don't let other people in on our needs either very easily. Usually, it has to be something very urgent or important for us to be like, oh, actually, I could use some help with this. We'd much rather just do it ourselves. But that doesn't mean that that's right. Like it means that we need to put more effort into being attentive to the needs of the people around us. And serving them, caring for them. And this is an instance where our house churches are actually really helpful, right? In a church of, there's not that many of us here today, but in a church of about 200 people, it's impossible to know the needs of every single person and to serve every single person. There's just too many people. But if you're a part of a small group or a house church, it's really easy to know, or it's not really easy, but it's doable to know the needs of the people in your group and to serve them. It's a lot. You can serve a small group. You can't serve 200 people at the same time. It's just overwhelming. And so if you're not part of a house church, I would encourage you to join one because we would love to have you and to put you in. Talk to myself or to Phil. Or to Lindsay. There you go. And he also kind of reinforces this when Paul says, serve one another. Other versions will say humbly. You likely have heard the saying, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. We're called to serve one another, not primarily thinking about what we need or want or desire, but thinking first of the needs of the people around us, the needs of the people in our church, before ours. And thirdly, does the slave require anything in order to keep on serving? Other than like food and water to stay alive. But other than that, no. Like they serve because that's their job as slaves. Like, they don't bring their master food and then get upset because, well, he didn't say thank you. Can you imagine like a slave bringing their food to their master and be like, well, that's the last time I'm bringing you food ever again. Like that, you'd just be like, well, I hope you enjoyed your life because you're done. But like they don't get an option. They serve because that's what their job is to do. And I think that's really important for us to pay attention because I know that for myself, and maybe for you too, that I don't mind serving people who are grateful and just thank me and make me feel so awesome for helping them. I quite enjoy it actually. But if if someone will reciprocate my serving, because then I get something out of it and it's pretty great. But if I do something nice for them and they don't seem appreciative of it one bit, well then I'm like, well then too bad for you. I guess I'm not serving you ever again because it didn't make me feel good. Or even worse, if they seem entitled that I help them, well, then I leave frustrated and angry. Or if they complain about the service that I did for them, well, then it's like, well, don't come crying to me if you ever need help again, because too bad. But those are all selfish reasons for serving. That's actually all about me. Similar to what God teaches about love, right? If you love those who love you, well, then that's no credit to you. You already got your reward for that. But if we're called to love our enemies, love when you don't get anything back for it. Serve when it doesn't feel good to do it, when you don't get payment back for your service. And now notice how Paul sets this up. He goes from saying, so you're free from the law to do, and not to do whatever you want. You're free to serve. And the word serve, like, heavily involved in slaves. So you're free to be slaves. Like, you're like, well, how does that make sense? I thought we were free, Paul. But true freedom is not something, as we saw earlier, to push us to sin more. You don't just get to do whatever we want. It's also not something you do just to recognize, not just to be like, oh, I'm free, cool. And then like, well, what does that mean? I don't know. I just know that I'm free. Like, it actually moves you to action, to do something. One commentator said, true freedom is realized only in the slavery of love. When we're moved and controlled by the love of God, that is when we are the most free. We often use the analogy of, like, if you lived in a country without laws, would there be more freedom? Like, no. And we experience the most freedom in the Lord when we are in bondage to serving those around us and to serving Him. So now that was verse 13. It took us a little while. Now let's look at verses 14 and 15. It says, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Now, this verse 14 seems quite odd, because Jesus says, like, Jesus before, when he was walking the earth, said that there's two greatest commands, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And those two summed up the whole law, so why is it that Paul only mentions the second one here? And I think that the reason is similar to when James says that faith without works is dead. Like, when you love your neighbor as yourself, it's the practical outworking of your faith, proof of your love for God and your service to Him. You can't love your neighbor as yourself unless you're actively loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So, why is this important? We look at verse 15, because that will happen. Read it again. If you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. That is what will happen when we don't do that. When loving and service and humility are not pursued, legalism, infighting find a home and are allowed a place in the church, and it will fracture. And it's unfortunately not very difficult to find examples of churches who have split. It's pretty common, actually. And the way to combat that fracturing, is to love one another, to serve one another. Choosing to love one another does wonders for your heart, and it isn't something where God says, man, it would be really nice if you did this, like it's an option. It's not an option. There are huge consequences if we neglect lovingly serving one another. So, what might this look like in our daily lives? Because it would be easy to leave the church and think, well, I better go shovel someone's driveway or else I'm a sinner because I didn't serve someone. Now, I think that one fear that we have in increasing the amount that we serve one another is that, like, what if nobody reciprocates? What if, like, we're all called to love one another, but what if I serve everyone and no one does it for me? Which is a legitimate fear, right? Like, it's very discouraging when you seem to putting way more effort with those around you than they do with you. And a few weeks ago, we were talking about the poor in youth group, and as I was studying, I came across Malachi 3, verse 10, which essentially says, test me and how you give money away, where God is saying, yeah, test me and the amount that you give money away, and see if I won't open the heavens and basically bless you. It's one of the only places where God invites us to test him, to test his goodness. And I think that if God were to respond to that fear, he would respond in a very similar way and saying, like, test me and see if I won't pour out my blessing on you if you obey me and serve one another. Just try me positively and see how good I am. And the other thing to note is that all of our ways of serving one another are going to look different. I can't serve in the same way that Phil does, mainly because if I tried to play guitar for you up front, you guys would not be worshiping very well. But it's really easy to compare ourselves with each other and be like, well, if I can't serve like Joe Blow down the street, well, then my service means nothing. Which is a horrible lie of the enemy. If you turn to 1 Peter 4, verse 10. So here Peter is instructing the believers, and this is what he says. 1 Peter 4:10. As each one has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. So notice who's been given a gift to serve one another, right? Just the pastors? No. Just the elders? Just the deacons? Just the deaconesses? No. It says, as each has received. Each, that's everyone, every believer, every Christian, as each one of us has been given a gift that we can use to serve one another. So that means if you're 90 years old and you're in a care home, God has given you a gift to serve others with. Or if you are 3 or 5 or 10 or 15, you've been given a gift to serve one another. If you're an exhausted parent like me, God has given you a gift to serve others with. And those won't look the same in how they are used, but we can know for sure that God has given each one of us a gift to use to serve one another, because he said exactly that. And serving one another doesn't always have to be just something physical that you do for them. It's a lot more about your attitude in whatever you're doing. It could be like the example of a gift that Peter uses right after is that if you speak, like speaking is one of the gifts. So it's not just doing physical things for people. It's a lot more of having an attitude of a servant, that you are going to do something for other people. Now, if we want a real flesh and blood example of this, of what it looks like, we look to Jesus. Jesus, the God of the universe, who willingly came to earth as a man, right? He humbled himself. He didn't look at equality with God as something to hold on to for dear life, but he willingly laid that down and came to earth to serve each and every one of us. And that is why we can serve. We don't serve because, well, God said so, so I better buckle up and do it, right? It's not just, we'll get pretty bitter if we just try and do it really hard. But if we look to Christ and see that was the example of his life and all that he's done for us, we can look to him and be like, okay, if that is what God has done for me, then I can show just a glimmer of that to the world around me. And Jesus did that despite having all the same hardships that we go through on our day-to-day lives. He showed service. He served even the worst, most outcast, diseased people. And he was so humble and servant-hearted that he was willing to suffer and die on our behalf. And he did it while we were still hostile to him, before we didn't do anything to deserve it. It is because of his example that we can serve those around us. Just like we read earlier in Luke 22, verse 26. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant. The greater we think we are, the more important we think we are, the more servant-hearted that should drive us to be. The more we should seek to outserve the people around us. Because as we do, the benefit is, as we serve those around us, they may catch a glimpse of the heart of God and see, like, man, these people are so servant-hearted towards each other, towards the world around them. It must be a reflection of the God that they serve. And so today we also get to celebrate that by taking communion, remembering the servant of all who came to the earth, who died in our place so that we could be set free to serve one another. And so I'll call up the elders, and we're gonna pass out the elements as elders because we want to serve you. It didn't feel right to have you come and serve yourselves on a Sunday where we're talking about serving one another. So as leaders, we're gonna serve you a communion, and then once we have both of the elements, we'll eat and drink together. As I was writing this, I realized that you could walk away from the sermon a little discouraged, like, oh man, I need to do more. But I also thought about, imagine how great it would be to be part of a group of believers where everyone was 100% committed to serving one another all the time. Like, how great would it be how richly would the love of God be flowing through us all? And I think we would all love to be part of a church. Not that we're doing horribly at this, but it would be so great to know that no matter what, I don't even have to ask. There are people ready and willing to jump in and serve at any time. But that starts with us. And so I pray that as we go out this week, that we would be diligent in looking to who Christ is and serving others through his love. Have a great week.